Hello, everyone, and welcome to this week's episode of Touchdown Tuesdays, the official football podcast of Brew Sports. I am Ian DeMars, and alongside me is Ryan Solomon. And Ryan, we're at a weird time in the sports here right now, where the main focus is shifting around the NBA playoffs, the MLB season just getting underway, and it seems like that the NFL is starting to kind of fall back in regards to being the main talked about sport at this point. Would you agree?
Yeah, there's also hockey playoffs going on too. So between the NBA, those people that like the NHL, and the start of the baseball season, the NFL really doesn't have a whole lot going for it right now. So they're already starting to talk maybe fantasy football stuff on NFL Live. So they're kind of trying to scrape the bottom of the barrel right now until some more news happens in the NFL.
Yeah, absolutely. And we're at that point where there are still some key storylines that are going on in regards to the world of the NFL. But this week, we're going to take a little bit of a turn of events here. Instead of starting with NFL talk, we're going to be focusing on one of the main football topics this past week, and that was the XFL. The XFL obviously is being restarted again after its a previous failed stint back in 2001. I believe it was 2001 when Vince McMahon tried starting his own football league to compete with the NFL. However, with their start next year in 2020, they had recently signed a multi-year TV deal to broadcast games on ESPN, ABC, and Fox networks. Now, it's important to note that it's a multi-year deal, and this is planned out almost a full year before the games actually start. So based off of that, Ryan, is the new XFL already in a better position than the AAF was at this point before they started?
Yeah, I think it is in a better position. A big reason for that is because it's not a new product anymore. It's a product that people are actually familiar with, and it has a place in football lore as that, thing that tried to start, that had a little bit of success that people were excited about. And it's not like it's coming out of nowhere now. It's something that's actually coming back. And what they're doing with actually getting things set up so early on is extremely helpful to them, because the AAF sort of rushed into it to try to beat out the XFL and get those new viewers that were interested in a different kind of football. And they didn't really have the groundwork laid for that sort of thing when they just sort of decided to jump into it. There was large amounts of money lost that the investors weren't ready for. And McMahon has done all of this before. So he knows how much money he can expect to lose before he could potentially garner some profit. So I don't think he's going to be scared away from perhaps low ratings at first or having to put a ton of money into this.
Yeah, and you look at the situation with Vince McMahon right now, it's kind of a tough one if you look at it, because WWE ratings have been going down. It seems like attendance at their events have been going down. So for him to restart this XFL league, it's a really big risk at this point with how struggling WWE seems to be. Obviously, it's still very popular, but it's just not where it's been since you look back at about 20 years ago when it was at its highest peak. But they're definitely in a better position. He's learned from that past, that 20 some years ago. He's put in a lot more money into the league this time, and I think he's doing quite a good job of not trying to rush into it. When he first started it, he wanted to get football going right away. The fact that he came out a little over a year ago saying that he wanted to start this league and didn't want to do it right away, wanted to push it off to 2020, that was definitely the smart decision for him. And I think this TV deal is just showing a sign that a lot of people believe in this revival of the XFL. I mean, getting games on ESPN, ABC, and Fox, that's a big time deal, because a lot of those stations are actually broadcast locally. At least the ABC and Fox ones are. You look at when the AAF was out, they really didn't have that much local broadcast because of its contract agreement. We saw the opening weekend game on CBS, but other than that, a lot of the games were either on CBS Sports or NFL Network. And then later on, we got to see a little bit more action on TNT. But the XFL is in a position right now where they're looking like they can make a lot of revenue, and having these three broadcast stations is definitely a huge part of why I think it's going to be more successful than going forward. But this brought us to our question of the week in regards to this saying, are they in a better position than the AF is right now? And Facebook and Twitter were in agreement. 69% of Facebook users said that they are in a better position than the AAF was. Twitter was actually higher. They're at about 88%. So are you feeling more like, I know we're both on agreement here, but do you think that at this point they're in position to at least make it past one season?
I think they could probably make it past one season. Yeah, because like I said, it was being bankrolled by one guy, Vince McMahon. He knows what it's going to take to get this thing into profitability, and he knows it's going to take more than one season. So he has to have the money laid out ahead of time to deal with the fact that he's just going to be hemorrhaging dollars for the first year. So I think that having done it already, he's going to anticipate how much he needs to put into it, how much he needs to have set aside, and I don't think he's going to be scared off when it doesn't really make very much the first season.
Yeah, and obviously, like you said, if there are issues, he still has the WWE to fall back on. So if WWE gets a huge uprise in revenue over these next year or so, I mean, that obviously covers some of the deficits that he's more than likely going to face in the XFL. And I feel like there's just something different. When I saw the rebranding of the XFL, I mean, obviously, branding, I think, is a big deal when it comes to sports. I could just tell that this was going to be different. When it first came out, the colors were unique, but they were also, you could kind of tell it was either going to be hit or miss. With the new branding that they have, I think they're showing that they are primed to be in a great position to move forward, to last at least one season, and to possibly make this work for years to come. But that's just something that we're going to have to wait and see once that weekend. And I believe it's February 8th when the first game is next year in 2020. So that's something we'll have to keep an eye out for. But we still got a long ways before that. However, we did find out earlier this week that they did name another head coach and GM in the league. The Los Angeles team named Winston Moss, a former Green Bay Packers player, as the head coach and the GM. Some of these coaches and GMs have kind of been based off of location. Were you a little bit surprised on this one? Or what were you thinking?
Yeah, I mean, you'd think you'd want somebody who has a little bit more name recognition than Winston Moss to be the GM and head coach in Los Angeles, because that's obviously a city with a lot of star power. There's a lot of people there that you could pull from that have either played for one of the teams there, or perhaps even a general manager that has some affiliation with the entertainment industry would have been a good fit there. So Winston Moss doesn't really strike me as somebody that necessarily fits with the city. He doesn't necessarily strike me as a guy that's going to bring fans in because, you know, they have Winston Moss as their coach and general manager. So it is somewhat surprising for a league that tries to pride itself on star power that they went with a guy who has a little bit more anonymity.
Yeah, and I think that the focus of the XFL obviously is to get a lot of big names, but I think they also want to get in some guys that might put in a unique twist on it. Now, Winston Moss, obviously, he's a name that is recognizable because he did play in the NFL, but obviously he's not a big name, kind of like the Bob Stoops when he got hired. Obviously, he was a big-time college football coach. Or Jim Zorn for Seattle, who's been around that area before. So some of these coaches have either been pretty big name or were at one point big name. Winston Moss kind of is in that in-between where he was relevant, but he wasn't like a superstar caliber relevant. So I think that's something that puts a unique twist on it, and it'll be interesting to see how that dynamic works out in Los Angeles. But looking at the coaching aspect in the XFL, there actually is still one city that has not named a coach, and that is the Houston franchise. Now, I'm not sure where they are planning on going with direction and coaching for this, but if you had to put some sort of name out there that could possibly fit that mold, who do you think they would go after to be the Houston coach?
Well, I think that they would want to go with somebody who is from Texas, perhaps somebody that played for the Oilers back in the day. I'm thinking somebody maybe like a Warren Moon type person. He would be somebody that would fit well. Another person in Texas who I know has a very good gig already and probably doesn't want to leave it, but it would be a good fit, would be Tony Romo.
Yeah, and I think both those are decent options. Warren Moon was actually one of the first names that came to mind, so you beat me to that on that one. Tony Romo is kind of an interesting play because he's in a pretty unique situation right now. He's done a phenomenal job being color commentator on CBS for NFL games, and he's also trying to get his golf game going as he's recently been, or he's playing in the Byron Nelson tournament this weekend for the PGA. So it'll be interesting to see what he ends up doing. I feel like at this point that with his success at CBS, I think that they want to keep him there long term. So I feel like because of that, they wouldn't want to keep him there. I feel like that for the Houston one, though, I think it's going to. I'm leaning towards more of a past college coach for the state of Texas. I'm not sure who it would be at this point, but I feel like that they're going to go after someone within that Texas area to be the coach, kind of like what they did with I believe is the Oklahoma franchise with Bob Stoops. So I feel like that's the best option to go at here, and I think that would be was it the Dallas franchise that they named Bob Stoops?
And the thing about Tony Romo is there were interesting rumors that maybe he would come back at some point to coach the Dallas Cowboys franchise. And obviously that's incredibly speculative because, like you said, he's doing a phenomenal job right now as a commentator. He's one of my favorite commentators. I'm sure he's fairly happy where he's at. So I don't really see him moving anytime soon, but I think it's a name that you could possibly see floated around when they discuss coaching candidates.
Yeah. And I know I had to ask this, but was Bob Stoops for the Dallas franchise in the XFL?
I don't remember which one he's going to, actually.
Okay. I believe it was the Dallas one. I was thinking Oklahoma, but I don't think Oklahoma has one. I'm just thinking of when he coached at Oklahoma. But he is one of the coaches in the XFL, and we should probably find out, I would assume within the next month, or at least by the beginning of summer, who that last coach and GM for the Houston franchise will be. But let's move on back to the NFL now. So there were a couple of interesting storylines that did happen this past week. I think the main one that we should talk about to start has to be Jason Pierre-Paul. Unfortunately, he was in a car accident, was released from the hospital, and this past week it was found out that he had actually fractured his neck in that car accident and is expected to miss the upcoming season for the Tampa Bay Buccaneers. How big of a blow is it for that franchise?
Well, obviously, it's a really big, devastating event for Jason Pierre-Paul. For the Tampa Bay Buccaneers, in all honesty, it doesn't really do a whole lot for their season because they have a roster that they need to completely revamp in order to be relevant in the NFC, let alone to compete for a championship. So they're in a division right now with the Falcons, who are trying to retool their team to get to the point where they can be back in contention for a Super Bowl, where they were just a couple years ago. The Saints, who are obviously a major favorite this year to reach the NFC Championship game. And the Buccaneers don't even really know what they're doing at quarterback anymore because they still have Jameis Winston, but obviously he may not be the long-term fit for the future that they need. And so losing Jason Pierre-Paul, who hasn't been the dominant force that he was when he first entered to the league as an incredibly explosive edge rusher, doesn't really do much for their chances this season because there weren't high expectations one way or another anyway. So all that it really does for them is probably increases their odds of getting a higher draft pick. And at this point, you need to know if Jameis Winston is your guy going forward. And if he's not, you have a good look at one of the top quarterbacks coming in next year into the draft because they're probably going to be one of those top 5 picks.
Yeah, it's an unfortunate situation, obviously, for both sides. Jason Pierre-Paul, this isn't the first kind of like freak accident that has happened to him. Obviously, there was the whole fireworks incident a couple years ago where he did lose a couple fingers on his hand, and now this whole incident with the car accident. It kind of makes me wonder if he might be thinking that it might be time for him to shut it down. Now, obviously, these injuries are freak injuries that happen off the field, but the fireworks incident, that was a life-threatening incident. And obviously, a car accident can do the same effect. So I feel like he's going to have to think hard about what's he going to want to do going forward. It would not surprise me if we might have possibly seen his last game. But I still think he has a lot that he can give to the game. He's still, I think, an enforcer on the quarterback, but obviously he's not what he was when he was with the Giants early on in his career. But it's something that he has to consider because these past couple of injuries that he's suffered are life-altering injuries that can play a big effect, not just in the NFL, but your life after the NFL. But now looking at the Tampa Bay side of this, they're in a position where I don't think no one really expects them to win their division this year. If anything, they could be a wild card team coming out of the NFC, but they have a lot of question marks. There's the whole question on, is Gerald McCoy going to be able to commit to that team? There's been reports that they might trade him. Who knows what's going to happen there? Jameis Winston's had some off the field issues. He's been in and out of the starting lineup over the past year. What are they going to do with him? So if they're at that point this year where the first half of the season they're struggling and under 500, don't be surprised if we see them maybe bench Jameis Winston or trade someone on that team. Maybe it's a McCoy. Maybe it's a Mike Evans even. Who knows? Maybe it's a Jameis Winston. There's a lot of things that could happen to this team. I think they're kind of in a dysfunctional state right now just because they're in a weird situation with some of their key players. And I think in order for them to kind of build for the future, that they need to evaluate these players more. And I think that's why they're doing that a lot more with guys like Jameis Winston and Gerald McCoy. That's why he's been mentioned in a lot of trade rumors. So I think this was just a bad timing for them because this kind of puts a lot more pressure on the team and kind of makes them wonder what they're actually going to do in the future. Because as you said, if they're struggling this year, it wouldn't be a surprise if they try going after a quarterback next year. And next year's quarterback class is a stacked quarterback class. So if any year's the year to draft a quarterback, next year would be the year for that team. So that is definitely something for sure to keep an eye out.
So in a weird way, it could potentially work out for the better for them. And like we said, it's terrible for Jason Pierre-Paul to have to go through this. But in terms of the Buccaneers franchise, it could end up being a blessing in disguise, sort of.
Yeah, and like you said, there's nothing, no offense to Jameis Winston. The guy has potential to be a franchise quarterback in the NFL, but a lot of these off-the-field issues have kind of hindered his playing career. And also, that's hindered his career has been the inconsistency on the field that we really didn't see too much of in college. And that's sometimes what we see out of these quarterbacks that get pressured in being that top overall pick. So that's something that is going to be interesting to watch out for going into training camp, just to see how this team's able to overcome all this adversity that appears to come in their ways. But let's move on to a guy that we seem to talk about almost every week here on the show, and that's Le'Veon Bell. So Le'Veon Bell had said he wasn't going to be going to voluntary minicamp, and the reason why he said that is because he wants to stick to his formula. So obviously we've seen what his formula has been these last couple of off seasons, holding out, not playing at certain points of the year, missing a whole year. Is this a good sign for the Jets that he's saying that he's sticking to his formula?
Yeah, this isn't ideal. When you get a player and bring him in, you want him to be all about the team. And Le'Veon Bell was playing the role of guy who was disgruntled because he felt he was being treated unfairly by the Steelers. And so the presumption there is that he's going to come in and work hard for a team that's willing to give him the contract that he wanted. And so now that he has the contract that he, for the most part wants, sure, it might not be as much money as he was asking for, but it's still a really solid contract, you would expect that he would be willing to come in and work with the team. Because this is a new set of guys, this is a new set of management, this is a new coach, compared to what he had in Pittsburgh. And you would think he would at very least want to come in and make a first impression on this franchise. And instead, he's distancing himself. And now the message that's coming across here is, I'm better than the rest of the team. I'm Le'Veon Bell. I don't need to do the work that the rest of the guys do. I don't want to be part of it. And so that's obviously disconcerting as a GM, as a coach, as an owner, that the guy that you just paid a ton of money for to bring in to supposedly be your workhorse back is going to kind of shun the rest of the team.
Yeah, looking at Le'Veon Bell, obviously he's had some past issues before, but I actually think this is a good sign for the Jets. And obviously you can say what you want about what has happened these last few off seasons, but I mean, he's being honest with the Jets, and I feel like there's a difference between what he was doing with the Steelers and what he's doing right here in this scenario with the Jets. When he was with the Steelers, he was being somewhat brutally honest and somewhat hiding some things that we really don't know about. And with this situation with the Jets, I mean, he's just saying he's sticking to his formula. He's not going out of his way and just not dodging these questions. He's not bluntly saying, I don't need to do this. obviously in the case like this where he says he's sick to his formula, he's showing that I can do what I want because I'm that good. But I think this is actually a way of him being honest and actually showing that he wants to be with this franchise and commit to this franchise. Because if this was the case with the Steelers, I feel like he goes at this a completely different way. So I'm actually okay with what he said, and I think that the Jets are going to respect that.
Yeah, I mean, that's one way to look at it, but I still think that you need to build up some equity with your new team before you go ahead and decide that you're going to do your own thing. It would at least, if he was there a year or two and then decided that he was going to kind of do his own routine, so like Giannis Antetokounmpo does with the Bucks, he doesn't really work out with any of the other stars in the NBA. That's obviously for different reasons than Le'Veon Bell, but once you gain the reputation of being somebody that's trustworthy and that you know is going to work hard, then you can go ahead and give him some slack. But I think for the first season, he should be there with the team.
Yeah, and I think that we're really going to find out the answer of how committed he is to his team once July and August comes on, when training camp starts, because I don't think we're going to miss him or see him miss a third straight year of training camp. Because if he does, it's going to be pretty absurd. I don't really see him in any conflict as of right now, except for what people are saying about this quote he said. But I think we'll end up seeing him at training camp, and I think all of this is just going to be blown out of proportion when we look at it 5 or 6 months from now. So, Ryan, real question here is, do you think that he reports on time for training camp, or do you think for some reason he's going to do what he typically does and just miss something at the beginning?
I think that he'll report for training camp. I don't think he really has a reason not to. So I think he'll probably be there.
Okay. And like I said, we're getting closer to training camp. We're only a few months away as we get near summer. So, like I said, unless we hear something else out of proportion from Le'Veon Bell the next few months, this probably will be the last time that we hear some sort of crazy thing from Le'Veon Bell until training camp. But let's move on now. So let's talk. Obviously, that we're a couple of weeks removed from the NFL draft, and looking at the NFL, what typically happens shortly after is a lot of people start guessing who they think is going to be the best rookie coming out, and look at their first season in the NFL. So let's talk about our predictions for right now for rookie of the year. So let's start on the offensive side of the ball. Who do you think wins offensive rookie of the year this year in the NFL?
This is a tough question because there are any number of ways that you could go with this. And I think a big part of it is going to just be determined by which player is going to have a starting role, at least on a team that's going to be successful. And I think that guy is actually N'Keal Harry, the wide receiver from Arizona State that got drafted 32nd overall to the Patriots. And I say this because the Patriots need wide receiver options, or at least pass catcher options, after losing Gronk, after losing some of their other players that they had in the receiving core last year. So they have a vacancy there that N'Keal Harry can help fill. And I think he's going to have a great year catching passes from Tom Brady. And I think that out of the other players that you see, they're probably going to have an impact. You look at, obviously, Kyler Murray might be good there. You're not sure necessarily about some of the other players like Daniel Jones or Dwayne Haskins, whether they're going to start for sure. N'Keal Harry almost certainly is going to get looks. And I think that he's going to be the guy at the end of the season who becomes valuable for his team. So I'm going to go with Harry.
Yeah, that's definitely a solid option.
You don't seem enthused about it.
Yeah, it's kind of a tough situation looking at N'Keal Harry because I think he could be a solid contributor for that team, but it's just kind of tough knowing how the Patriots use their system when it comes to passing the ball. There are some weeks where we see a lot of guys stand out. Then there are some weeks where, yeah, they don't do anything or get to that point where they just completely fall out of the rotation. And I feel like that's something that could end up hurting N'Keal Harry or Henry. I think he definitely has that ability to be in that top 5 or even top 3, but I feel like it's tough to go with a wide receiver. Obviously, I think like a lot of the choices are nowadays either running back or quarterback. So that's partially why I'm not going with Harry on this one. it's kind of a tough decision looking at this class because I feel like it's going to be a first or one of the first round picks. So okay, could be a quarterback, could be Dwayne Haskins, could be Kyler Murray, could be Daniel Jones. The only running back in the first round was Josh Jacobs from Alabama, who went to the Oakland Raiders. There are a couple other guys as well. You have the tight ends, T.J. Hawkinson, Noah Fant, Marquise Hollywood Brown's an option as well. I don't know. It's kind of wide open. If I'm honestly gonna go with someone, I think it's someone that goes to a team that desperately needs this position filled. That's why I'm going to say Noah Fant for the Broncos. The Broncos have been missing that tight end position over the last few years. They drafted Jake Butt, who they were hoping was going to be that guy after he fell because of an injury. And he's had some injuries since he's come to the NFL, so that's not looking good. They drafted Troy Fumagalli out of Wisconsin last year, and he got injured, so they weren't able to really test him out. So the tight end position's been a tough spot there. And they got a quarterback now in Joe Flacco who does a very good job of throwing the ball to his tight ends and commits to the tight ends. So that's why I think Noah Fant could be a guy that gets that opportunity right away. There have been some questions about how he's going to do run blocking wise, but I think that even if you put him out in the slot or even on the outside, I think he could be a big factor for that offense because I think the Denver Broncos, they're going to surprise some people this year. And whether that's Joe Flacco for the whole year or whether it's Drew Lock coming in at some point. I think that Noah Fant's going to be able to burst out in that offense. I think he's going to have a pretty big year for that team.
I just don't see a tight end getting enough play to be a rookie of the year or offensive rookie of the year. I just think that there's so many other players that are going to get more of a showcasing type role. And tight ends, of course, some of them do very well. George Kittle did very well. Rob Gronkowski did very well. Travis Kelce did very well. But there's going to be guys that are going to be getting more touches. That are going to be a more integral part of the team. And I just don't see a tight end getting that sort of recognition this first year in the league.
Yeah, and you look at the case for both our picks. I could see a case where both these guys have less than 50 receptions the whole year. But I could also see them getting between 6 and 10 touchdowns. I think the touchdowns are going to play a key factor for them in regards to getting votes for Rookie of the Year. What are your thoughts on that?
Say that again and cut out on me.
Yeah, I was saying how I think it's not going to be more on the quantity in regards to receptions. I feel like it's going to be more in regards to quantity of touchdowns. I feel like these guys can get above 5 touchdowns, maybe even get close to 10 touchdowns. I think that could play a key factor into either one of these guys having a solid rookie year, possibly getting the Rookie of the Year award for offense.
I think it's more about number of touches and number of yards produced because I think that you can vulture touchdowns very easily. There can be players in the league that get, 10 touches a year and end up with 6 touchdowns. And then there's a guy out there who can get 60 touches a year and end up with 3 touchdowns. So I think that looking at the overall body of work is going to be the big determining factor in who gets the Rookie of the Year on the offensive side. I don't think it'll necessarily be strictly the touchdown number that's going to be the cause.
Okay. Then let's flip the other side of football. Let's look at the defense. Based off of kind of what we talked about on offense, who do you think takes on defense?
Defense is interesting because you have to look at it the same way you looked at the offense. So the best player in the draft could very potentially be a defensive tackle, but defensive tackles usually don't get noticed as much because what they do is largely creating space for other players to shine. So looking at the guys that we have this year to pick from, I'm going to go out on a limb and say it's probably somebody that's going to be playing either in the linebacking core or on the edge, and I'm going to go with Nick Bosa for the 49ers. I think Nick Bosa is going to be a big time factor this year because the 49ers get Jimmy Garoppolo back, so they might have a fighting chance at taking that division away from the Rams if they do well enough. Their team is pretty good. They have a decent roster, and Nick Bosa playing off the edge could definitely accumulate a large number of sacks or a large number of fumbles or fumbles forced. So I could see him getting that Rookie of the Year.
Yeah, Nick Bosa, I think it's a pretty good option for Rookie of the Year defensively. Obviously, yeah, put up some pretty big numbers in college, and I think he's going to a good place in San Francisco. Well, he'll have that opportunity to play right away. I know how a lot, as you had mentioned, like typically a defensive tackle can be rated as the best defensive prospect coming into the draft. And that's why I'm gonna pick a defensive tackle, but it's probably not the one you're probably not thinking of the one I'm thinking of.
Christian Wilkins?
I'm not thinking of Christian Wilkins. I thought you were gonna say Quentin Williams, but I'm actually gonna go with Ed Oliver for Buffalo. And the reason why I'm saying that, I've said some mixed things about Ed Oliver before. I've said that he played in a smaller conference, so that plays into a factor of his production. But he's also a dynamic force on that team. And he was also getting double and triple team like another guy I think could do on this league, and that's Rashawn Gary. But I think he's going to a good spot in Buffalo where they already have a very solid defense and they needed to get some more pressure on that defensive line. I think Ed Oliver could do that for them. I think he has that potential to maybe get double-digit sacks for them this year. And for a defensive tackle, that's a pretty impressive number. So I think that he's going to end up taking that award this year defensively. But I think that's going to be a battle between those defensive tackles because I do think that Quentin Williams could have a very good year for the New York Jets. I also think like a guy like Christian Wilkins could do a good job of piggybacking off of Grady Jarrett in Atlanta. So I do think that the defensive tackles are going to show up this year, and I think one of them is going to win Defensive Rookie of the Year, but my guy right now is Ed Oliver.
I really like Ed Oliver. I think he's going to be a great player. I just still stick to the fact that the impact of a defensive tackle is not necessarily shown in statistics, which is what people usually use to quantify which player should be Rookie of the Year or MVP. And that's why some of the best players, some of the most highly paid players are these interior linemen, and you don't always even know their name just because they don't get the high sack totals, they don't get interceptions, they don't get fumbles forced. They just kind of clog up the middle sometimes and free up other guys. So I think it would be really difficult for Ed Oliver to get Defensive Rookie of the Year, but I think he's definitely a player that will perform as one of the top defensive players coming out of this draft.
All right. Yeah, I think we're definitely both in agreement on him being a special talent. Let's do a surprise out there. So if we had to pick anyone, either offensive or defensive, from the draft outside of the first round that could win Rookie of the Year, who do you think it would be?
That's a tough call because you never really know which player is going to step up and be the next Tom Brady, type quarterback, or the next this random player like Donald Driver who's going to end up being good. He wasn't drafted high. But I'm going to go Drew Lock. He's a guy that I, from the beginning, pegged as the top quarterback in the draft. And I think that if Joe Flacco gets it, well, obviously if he gets injured, Drew Lock is going to get a look. But I think if he struggles early, we could definitely see Drew Lock coming in and having an impact on that Broncos team. And the Broncos still have a pretty solid defense, and they have some playmakers now on the offensive side of the ball. So if Drew Lock does get a look, we could see him putting up some decent numbers his first season.
Yeah, I think Drew Lock's definitely a popular choice, especially since a lot of people had him going in the first round. And obviously it depends on how Joe Flacco plays. Because remember last year, he was playing pretty well to start off the year. Then he got injured, and ended up being why Lamar Jackson stole that opportunity from him when he was able to get back. I'm going to go with a guy who was a big-time playmaker in big-time games in college. That's Hunter Renfrow, the guy who was drafted from Clemson and is now going to play with the Oakland Raiders. This guy was a beast when it came to getting big-time receptions in games, winning a national championship with his catch with 1 second left against Alabama, just putting up spectacular numbers in those big-time games. And like I said, if you need a guy to catch the ball on third or fourth down, he's the guy that they wanted to go to in college. I think he's going to be able to put that factor into the NFL. I think that's why John Gruden drafted him. A lot of people didn't even have Hunter Renfrow possibly going in the draft. So to see him get drafted, and I think he's going to a good spot in Oakland where they kind of need some receivers on that team. Obviously, getting Antonio Brown this offseason helps, but getting some of those slot receivers that can be factors on third and fourth down where you kind of depend on them the most, I think that puts him in a good spot. And I think he could be the sleeper pick to be Rookie of the Year.
You're picking a lot of guys that I really like as football players. And Hunter Renfrow is just a gamer. He's the guy that'll go in there and do whatever's asked of him. And I think he's going to be a very, very respectable player in the NFL. If you had to liken him to somebody who's in the NFL already right now, who would you say he's most like?
That's tough.
I was trying to figure it out, and I kept just going to white guy receivers, and then I realized I'm just picking that because they're white guy receivers.
I would say maybe he kind of reminds me a little bit of Cole Beasley.
See, white guy receiver.
Mm-hmm. I mean, I could also maybe it's just kind of tough because I feel like a lot of those guys are kind of those guys that get drafted late round who do well in college, but they're not sure if they're able to keep up to those abilities in the NFL. So it's kind of a weird situation on who to compare him to because some of these players that like stick around, you really don't know them too much. But I feel like that he's going to be one that sticks around and plays for a while in the NFL.
He sort of reminds me of like the absolute top echelon ceiling for him would be like a Hines Ward. And that's just because he'll go in and he'll do the dirty work. He's not really the biggest guy. He's not really the fastest guy, but he'll go in there and catch passes in traffic. He'll block. He'll do all of that stuff. And I think that's what makes him the most valuable is he's not just a specific one facet sort of guy.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, it'll be interesting to see how he works out with going to Oakland. Oakland had an interesting draft. They drafted a lot of players that played in the last couple of national championship games for Clemson and Alabama. So it'll be interesting to see how all those players end up playing out, maybe some of those players winning those honors. But let's stick with a player that we did talk about recently, and you had brought him up, and that was Nick Bosa. The reason why we're talking about him right now is because Richard Sherman made some comments about him, saying that hopefully his play makes up for some of his past comments. And the reason why he said that is because he's made some comments in the past about or not in favor of Colin Kaepernick kneeling for the national anthem. There have been reports that he had to kind of delete a lot of his past Twitter account due to liking some homophobic stuff on social media, also some racial stuff on social media. So what are kind of your thoughts on this? Were you kind of surprised that he brought this up, or is this something that they should really be concerned about?
I don't think they should really be concerned about it a whole lot. I mean, people say stuff on social media all the time. And realistically, everybody that's become an adult at some point in their life probably looks back on things that they've said, maybe even before the social media age, and think, wow, if that really got broadcast anywhere, I would probably be in a lot of trouble or people would view me differently. And the only difference now is that we can actually see everything that somebody's liked or everything that somebody's thought or posted in the past 15 years and decide whether we want to be offended by it or not. So I think whatever we see people doing on social media, it's really their business. I know it's posted everywhere and people are offended by everything and people want to dissect every little thing that happens on Twitter and happens on Facebook and happens on Instagram. But at the end of the day, it doesn't really matter for the franchise because they did already have one of the most divisive people in the NFL in Colin Kaepernick. And so having a guy who's kind of posting against him probably isn't really going to change anybody's opinion on the team at this point in time. I'm sure that it would have been easier for a lot of players on the team to have a guy with no social media background whatsoever who's never broadcast anything out there that has been unsavory or that people would disagree with. But it's sort of the nature of the kind of people that are graduating now from college and getting drafted is they're millennials who have grown up with the internet, and maybe they've put some of their biggest mistakes online, and I don't think we should necessarily fault them for that.
Looking at social media nowadays, obviously everybody puts stuff up there that they regret at some point. I'm sure you've done it. I know I've done it. So everyone does it at some point. It's kind of interesting that Richard Sherman brought this up. And it's interesting because obviously it's kind of an issue because he got drafted to the 49ers where they've had some of this stuff come up in the past. So, I mean, obviously they know how to handle it. But the fact that Sherman's bringing it up after the fact that he wasn't even on the team when Kaepernick was there, it's kind of surprising, in my opinion. I mean, I don't think this is going to be an issue either because we're seeing this happen a lot more nowadays where some of these big-time prospects and big-time athletes suddenly out of nowhere get called out for something that they posted on social media. Like 9 or 10 years ago. I mean, you look at obviously the whole issue with Laremy Tunsil a few years ago in the draft, where he was caught smoking a substance on social media, and up having him drop in the draft. Dante DiVincenzo in the NBA after the national championship game a couple of years ago had some past stuff on social media come up that people question. Josh Hader in Major League Baseball had that happen last year where some tweets resurfaced. So this isn't a surprise that it's continuing to happen with some big time athletes that are having success. And I think that's why it got brought up. I think his play is going to put all this away. And by the time we're halfway through the season, no one's even going to remember what happened back in May when this was all brought up.
I agree with that, because how often now have we even heard anything of Laremy Tunsil? This kind of stuff happens every single draft. I remember when Calvin Johnson was drafted, there was like a question that they asked him about, have you ever smoked marijuana? And I think he said yes. And at the time it was like, will this impact his career in the NFL? And hardly anything that people say right now really impacts their career in the NFL. As long as they can play and as long as there's no videos of them doing something horrible, they're probably going to be fine, and they're going to be regarded as a decent player as long as they produce on the field. And that's kind of how I think most people feel about this is Richard Sherman personified what every person says when a person comes into the NFL that has a questionable background is, well, if they can play, it's all going to be good.
And, I mean, it's been quite some time since we've heard Richard Sherman come out in the news in regards to some of his comments. So I think this was kind of just a little bit of a throwback to some of his days back in Seattle. But we're both in agreement here. We think this is just going to be flushed out of the way over the next couple of months. It's not even going to be talked about once the season starts. So with that, let's move on. With us being at the end of the show, we got to do what we usually do, and that's talk about fantasy football. It's get to that point where now that everyone's been drafted, we can actually start kind of positioning, start ranking people for next year. So we're going to start doing that over the next few weeks. So right now we're going to look at the top 5 quarterbacks that should be drafted next year. Ryan, I'm going to go with you first. Who do you have as your list of top 5 quarterbacks?
Do you want to alternate, or do you want to just go straight up and down?
Yeah, we can do that. Let's alternate. So you do 5, then I'll do my 5 for and go from there.
Okay, so I'm going to go number 1, a very obvious choice, Patrick Mahomes. I think he had like a high percentage more fantasy points than any other quarterback each week last year. It was like he averaged 7 more points than the next closest or something ridiculous like that. At number 2, I'm going to go with Andrew Luck. I think he's only going to continue to grow on his performance from last season. I think he's going to put forth another really, really good fantasy year. And in a year last year where he was there were questions about whether he was going to be healthy or whether he'd be able to even throw the ball downfield, he answered a lot of those questions. At number 3, I'm going to go with Russell Wilson. Russell Wilson is really good for fantasy football because he not only throws for touchdowns, he also runs for an incredible amount of yards. He usually will have a couple of games at least each year where he leads his team in rushing. Then at number 4, for quarterbacks, I'm going to go with Aaron Rodgers. I think he's going to have a bounce back year to prove that Mike McCarthy was the problem, or at least he has that chip on his shoulder now that people are wondering if he has been the issue all along. So I think he's going to produce. And then I'm going to go with Drew Brees as my number 5. The Saints are going to have another really solid season, and I think he's going to be the top reason why. He's going to be dishing the ball to his running backs, and he's going to be launching it downfield and have a really good fantasy 2019 and 2020.
And looking at your list, I do think that all those guys have that ability to be in that top 5. I do agree with some of your positions. I also had Patrick Mahomes at number 1. I mean, after last year, it's kind of hard not to put that guy at number 1. So someone's going to have to step up to the plate and maybe throw 45, 50 touchdowns to get up to Patrick Mahomes' level. But I do agree with you on that. Number 2, I actually do have Russell Wilson at that spot, not number 3. As you had mentioned before, this guy puts up a lot of fantasy numbers, and he got that contract extension to show that he can play in the league. This guy can throw the ball, and he can do a lot of damage on the ground. So I do think that is going to be a big factor for the Seattle Seahawks this upcoming season. Number 3, I'm going to go Deshaun Watson. This is a guy that has a lot of similar ability to Russell Wilson, obviously a big issue last year was he had a banged up offensive line that allowed a lot of sacks. And I think that they're going to get that resolved. And I think that we're going to see that dual threat ability from Deshaun Watson. I think he's going to be able to put up a lot of big time numbers for that Houston Texas team. Number 4, I'm going to go with Aaron Rodgers. I do agree with you on that. I think he's going to bounce back. I think things are looking a little bit better. It's going to be interesting to see who steps up as that number 2 receiver in Green Bay, whether it's going to be Geronimo Allison, maybe a Marquez Valdez-Scantling. Who knows who's going to be that guy, but someone's going to have to be that next guy alongside Devontae Adams. And number 5, I'm going to go with someone you did not mention. Might be a little bit of surprise here. I'm going to go Baker Mayfield. The reason why I'm saying that is because this guy, for playing only 3/4 of the season, I mean, he broke the NFL record for most passing touchdowns by a quarterback. And you look at, he's got a lot more pretty solid weapons now, especially getting Odell Beckham Jr. I think that's just going to help boost his fantasy production. I think he's going to have a huge year for the Cleveland Browns. I'm pretty high on the Cleveland Browns right now. I think that he's going to show a lot of people why he was the number 1 pick last year. And he has a lot of playmaking ability with his legs as well. So don't be surprised with him putting up some good numbers on the ground as well next year.
See, I'm not as all in on the Browns as you are. I think that we're going to see some sophomore slumping from Baker Mayfield. I don't think all the pieces they brought in are necessarily going to gel super well at first. I think it's going to take some time for that team to actually get to the point where they match the hype surrounding them. And I definitely considered putting Deshaun Watson in the top 5. The only reason I did not was because, like you said, their offensive line was horrendous last year, and I thought about it, and it hasn't really changed that much to make me think that he's going to get enough time to throw. But when he came into the league, he put up huge numbers. I remember I picked him up off of waivers, and he was just great for the first couple weeks he was there until he got injured. So he definitely has the potential to be a top 5 fantasy quarterback.
Yeah, I definitely agree. Reason why I didn't have Andrew Luck up there is just because I think that team's gonna. That team can sometimes be one-dimensional in the passing game. A lot of his attention at times can go to T.Y. Hilton, which can play a factor into some of those numbers. So part of the reason why I had him left out, Drew Brees, as dominant as he has been throughout his career, I think they needed to get another piece on that offense that could help play with the guys they have there in Alvin Kamara and Michael Thomas. One guy I do want to say that we didn't mention, who I think could be a sleeper that no one really is talking about right now, I think that's Josh Allen from Buffalo. Because there were games last year where he was dominant running the ball. And that's something we didn't really see too much out of him in college. So there were games where he ran for over 100 yards and had a couple of touchdowns. I could see him putting up similar numbers like that, and I think he's going to improve the passing game. And I think that don't be surprised if this guy's in the top 10 at least or when it comes to fantasy football next year.
That would be a really interesting story to see Josh Allen have a really good season. The Buffalo Bills have quietly put together a pretty decent roster of players, and we talk about the Browns as that next team that's kind of up and coming, or at least you do. But it would be really interesting if the Browns and the Bills both all of a sudden were contenders for their respective divisions. I think that would be a really cool story for the NFL. If you look down the line for quarterbacks, there's actually a lot of guys you can get later in the rounds for fantasy football that will probably be solid. You can get Jared Goff, Carson Wentz, Ben Roethlisberger, Phillip Rivers, maybe Dak Prescott, who had a bad season last year, but he could rebound. Tom Brady, Jimmy Garoppolo, Kirk Cousins, Matt Stafford. There's no shortage of players that you can take later in the rounds without having to use up one of those top draft picks on a quarterback.
Yeah, definitely a lot of quarterbacks that can be taken in fantasy. It'll be interesting to see which one we didn't mention ends up in the top 5, because I feel like that always happens every year. But before we do end the show, there was something I did not mention, and we're going to talk about it. We're going to give our answer, and then next week we'll probably talk about it more as it continues. But of these 3 guys, who gets their contract extension first? Dak, Amari Cooper, Ezekiel. Give me your one guy.
I think Dak.
Okay. I think Dak could be that guy just because he and Amari Cooper are both up next year. But part of me's leaning towards Amari Cooper just because they gave up a first round pick for him, and they obviously liked what they got out of him. So I think because of his play, I think he would be the guy. But we'll talk more about that next week because that just started this week, and I feel like that's going to continue on next week. So with that said, that does bring us to the end of this week's episode. So Ryan, what final thoughts do you have for the viewers listening?
Thanks everyone for continuing to tune in. You can find us on Spreaker, Google Play, YouTube, iTunes. Those are the best places to find us. Make sure you give us a like and follow on Facebook and Twitter as we continue to grow. And thanks again for tuning in.
Yep, you said it perfectly, Ryan. Again, thank you for listening to this week's episode of Touchdown Tuesdays, the official football podcast of Bruce Sports. Again, listen to us each week on iTunes, Google Play, Spreaker, or even YouTube if you want to catch us live and stay up late with us. Check us out on the social media pages. We're on Facebook and Twitter. Do what you have to do to get us out there, bring the attention. We definitely appreciate everyone for listening and being a part of Touchdown Tuesdays, and we do look forward to bringing the news of the world of NFL, the XFL, college football, anything football, we'll be bringing to you every week, and we look forward to doing that next week. Thank you.